October 31st, 1737. Florence. A 70-year-old woman signs a document. The new government has already moved in. The dynasty is already over. What she writes in that document is still in force today. Here's what we're proving tonight. First, what Florence was actually worth in 1737 and why the Habsburgs had every legal right to move it all to Vienna. Second, what she put in that document. Specifically, why the structure of it, not the sentiment, is what has held for almost 300 years. Third, what the clause cost her personally. Because that last answer is what makes this not a victory story. Every painting in the Uffizi, every sculpture in the Bargello, every jewel, every scientific instrument, every library the Medici spent 3 centuries assembling. Still in Florence, still public, still there, not because of goodwill, because of a clause one woman wrote on an October afternoon when nobody powerful was watching. Everything here comes from primary documents and confirmed institutional sources. The wording of the Patto comes directly from the document held at the Archivio di Stato di Firenze, published by the Gallery degli Uffizi. The patronage record at Düsseldorf comes from Stefano Casciu's scholarship in the 2015 volume Medici Women, edited by Benedusi and Brown. Published by the Center for Reformation and Renaissance Studies. Where the record divides, I'll say so. Let's start with what Florence was worth in 1737, not emotionally, materially. 300 years. That's how long the Medici had been buying, commissioning, collecting. Cosimo the Elder in the 1430s. Lorenzo the Magnificent in the 1480s. Every Grand Duke after them. By the time the dynasty collapsed, what they had accumulated was not just art. It was the Uffizi, the Pitti Palace, the Medici villas, jewels, scientific instruments, collections tied directly to Galileo, who worked under Medici patronage, libraries, tapestries, bronzes from the finest workshops in Europe. And in July 1737, every single piece of it was legally up for grabs. So let's be specific about what we're talking about. Gian Gastone de' Medici, the last Grand Duke, Anna Maria Luisa's younger brother, died on July 9, 1737. No heir. The Treaty of Vienna, signed in 1735, had already assigned Tuscany to Francis Stephen of Lorraine. He was simultaneously the future husband of Maria Theresa and the future Holy Roman Emperor. Florence was now Habsburg territory, administered from Vienna. Under every applicable property law of the period, the new sovereign had the right to move the collection, all of it, to Vienna, to sell pieces, to disperse what 3 centuries had built. Who could stop him? Legally, nobody. And this had happened before, in living memory. The Gonzaga in Mantua, one of the great Italian collecting dynasties, had started selling their collection in 1627. Duke Vincenzo II, Gonzaga sold the first major portion to agents of Charles I of England. Months of negotiation. Every court in Europe watched. Nobody had legal standing to stop it. A sovereign's collection was a sovereign's property. Full stop. Then in 1630, Mantua was sacked. What the sale hadn't taken, the sack scattered. That collection has never been fully reconstructed. Was the Medici collection next? That's not a rhetorical question. That's what everyone with an interest in the transfer was calculating in the summer of 1737. So before you understand what Anna Maria Luisa did, you need to understand who she was by 1737. Not what she was born, who she had become, and specifically what she had watched happen to another dynasty's collection, up close from the inside. The Palatinate she arrived in as a new bride in 1691 was still recovering from the 9 Years' War. Louis XIV had systematically devastated the region just years before she got there. She had seen what an invading army did to a court, what it took, what it left. She arrived at 23 into the aftermath of that, spent the next 26 years building something remarkable inside it, and watched it remain vulnerable. She had spent 26 years as Electress Palatine in Dusseldorf, from 1691 until Johann Wilhelm died in 1716. The Gallery degli Uffizi described those years directly. She brought back to Florence, along with her Palatine collections, a refined artistic sensibility cultivated in Germany. What the scholarship confirms in more detail, she ran one of the most sophisticated musical courts in the Holy Roman Empire. Casciu's research identifies her direct patronage of the composer Agostino Steffani at Dusseldorf. 2 editions of Steffani's chamber duets survive today in the Conservatorio Luigi Cherubini Library in Florence. Material objects, still physically present, documents of what she commissioned and what she brought back when she came home. She supported Fortunato Celeri as Maestro di Cappella. She tracked what art moved, where, and what happened when it didn't move on proper terms. She supported Fortunato Celeri as Maestro di Cappella. She was not a spectator of court culture, she managed it. And she understood what happened to collections when dynasties ended without legal protection. She came back to Florence in 1717. She did not come back empty-handed. She brought with her the entire Palatine collection she had assembled over 26 years, jewels, paintings, objects. And she brought back something harder to inventory, a precise understanding of how courts worked, how collections were protected or lost, and what the legal architecture of a transfer looked like when it was done right versus when it was left to chance. She returned to a dynasty in slow collapse. Giangastone had become Grand Duke in 1723, and the governance of Tuscany was running on momentum while Europe negotiated its future without consulting a single Medici. In 1713, her father Cosimo III had managed to alter the Tuscan succession laws to allow for her accession. He'd spent years lobbying the European powers to recognize it. It didn't hold. By 1735, the powers had decided Francis Stephen of Lorraine would inherit. The legal change Cosimo III had fought for was overruled by the men at the treaty table. Anna Maria Luisa was not at that table. Under the treaty that transferred Tuscany, she was listed as a private citizen, a pension, an apartment in the Pitti Palace. That was the full extent of her formal standing in the new order. But here is what the treaty had not thought about. When Giangastone died, the sovereign territory of Tuscany passed to Francis Stephen. But the allodial possessions, the personal estate of the Medici dynasty, legally separate from the Grand Ducal office, passed to Anna Maria Luisa, last surviving member of the main branch. The personal inheritance was hers, the art was hers, legally, the Uffizi contents, the Pitti holdings, the jewels, the libraries. Everything the Medici had accumulated as a family, distinct from what they held as rulers, was under her name. And here is where you have to slow down and follow the logic. Because this is the moment that mattered. The Habsburgs had the territory, the palace, the political succession. But the art, the actual collection, was Anna Maria Luisa's personal property, not the states, not the Grand Duchies. hers. The Habsburgs wanted it. So in October 1737, she began negotiations. She had something the Habsburgs wanted. The question was, what would she ask for it? What could she ask for when she had no political standing, no seat at any treaty table, and the new government had already begun treating her personal estate as an administrative formality? She didn't ask for power. She asked for a condition. On October 31st, 1737, the Patto di Famiglia was signed. Here is where I need you to understand the legal structure, because this is the part most accounts get wrong, and getting it wrong means missing everything. The Patto di Famiglia is not a gift. A gift you can give away again. You can sell a gift, move it, transfer it. A conditional donation with a restriction attached to the title itself. That is an entirely different legal instrument. And Anna Maria Luisa signed a conditional donation. The wording of the document, published by the Gallery degli Uffizi, is precise. She donated to the Tuscan state, the incoming Habsburg succession, the galleries, paintings, statues, libraries, jewels, and other precious objects of the Medici collections. The exact condition, in her own words, on the express condition that they are for the ornament of the state, for the utility of the public, and to attract the curiosity of foreigners, and that nothing will be transported or removed from the capital and state of the Grand Duchy. Galleries, paintings, statues, libraries, jewels, all of it, inalienable, public, permanently in Florence. To receive the collection and violate the condition are legally mutually exclusive. You cannot do both. Whoever holds the title holds the obligation. There is no separating them. So what did Francis Stevens' lawyers do? They accepted it. And here is something worth sitting with, not for sentiment, but for the structure. She designed a situation where saying yes to the donation meant accepting the restriction permanently attached to the title. And saying no to the donation meant the collection stayed with her as private property, subject to her will, which the Habsburgs could not control or predict. She had made accepting her terms the better legal option, because the alternative was worse. If they rejected the donation, the collection remained with Anna Maria Luisa personally, her private estate, to be disposed of by her will. Litigating the Medici personal inheritance against competing claims would have taken years with no guaranteed outcome. Conditional ownership of the best collection in Italy was better than a decade in probate. They took the deal. The condition came with it. Now, before we look at whether it held, I want to be honest about what the documents don't tell us. Because the record splits here, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. We don't know exactly why she structured the donation the way she did. Some historians read it as dynastic pride, the Medici name surviving in objects when it could no longer survive in people. Others, working from her private correspondence, read something colder. A woman who understood that the collection was the only negotiating leverage she had left, and who designed its transfer to maximize the constraint on the people who had otherwise taken everything from her. Both readings fit the evidence. The document itself doesn't disclose motivation. What it discloses is competence, a precise understanding of how title works, of what the Gonzaga Precedent meant, and of how to structure a transfer that wouldn't end the same way. We'll never know for certain which impulse was dominant. Probably both were true at once. What we know is what the document does. No throne, no army, no political role, and she just legally bound every future sovereign of Tuscany to her terms through a contract. The only instrument she had left, used with complete precision. And here is the structural reason it has held, which is the part that matters for anyone who wants to understand how power actually works when you have none of the usual instruments of it. She did not design the Patto to depend on anyone's goodwill. She designed it so that protecting the collection was the legally rational choice for whoever held power. Francis Stephen didn't preserve the collection because he respected Anna Maria Luisa. He preserved it because breaking the condition would destroy his own title to the collection itself. She engineered a situation where keeping the collection intact and keeping valid legal title were the same act. That distinction matters enormously when you consider that the people who came after Francis Stephen, every subsequent Grand Duke, every administrator, every government, had no personal connection to her at all, no sentiment, no memory. And still the clause held, because the clause was not built on sentiment. It was built on title law. Why does this matter? Because every government that has held Tuscany since 1743 has had to reckon with the same structural reality. The collection's public character is inseparable from the title, and the title is inseparable from the condition. You cannot unpick one without destroying the other. That is not an accident of history. That is what she designed. Cassiu, writing in Medici Women, The Making of a Dynasty in Grand Ducal Tuscany, the 2015 scholarly volume from the Center for Reformation and Renaissance Studies, reads the Patto explicitly as political strategy, not grief. The last Medici identifying the single remaining mechanism of power and using it precisely. And here is where you might think the story has resolved. The clause works. Florence protected. It's a win. But Anna Maria Luisa was still alive when she signed it, and the clause didn't protect her. She lived 6 more years. In the Pitti Palace, in a reduced household, on a pension. The new administration replaced her senior servants, renegotiated her access to the properties her family had held for generations, reduced her ceremonial role to nothing substantive. She was not expelled. She was not imprisoned. There was no dramatic confrontation. She was, in the practical reality of what had happened, a prior occupant in a building that now belonged to someone else. The kind of person who gets a pension and a courtesy. Not the kind of person anyone was thinking about when decisions were being made. Do you see the shape of this? She had used the one transaction she controlled, the transfer of the collection, to insert a permanent legal constraint. And then she lived inside the constraint's consequences for 6 more years, in a city that was now someone else's, in a palace that was now someone else's, committing resources she still controlled to the work she still cared about. The active political world of Florence moved entirely around her, and yet she continued. Cassiu documents commissions she funded in San Lorenzo between 1738 and 1743. Vincenzo Miucci brought into fresco the cupola. Federico Ruggieri rebuilding the campanile in 1740 and supervising ongoing works in the Cappella dei Principi. Even in those final reduced years, still directing, still spending what remained on what had always mattered. She died on February 18, 1743, 75 years old, in the Pitti Palace where she had grown up and to which she had returned from Dusseldorf in 1717. The same palace where Gian Gastone had governed and now didn't. the same palace whose north wing the Habsburg administration had already redesigned. She had watched all of it happen around her and kept working anyway. The Gallery degli Uffizi mark the anniversary of her death every year on February 18th. The museums open for free, and a ceremony is held at her tomb in the Basilica di San Lorenzo. Not because she was Grand Duchess. She never was. The European powers had closed that door years before she died, because what she did on October 31st, 1737, is the reason there is anything left to visit. Here is the part that the monument version of this story leaves out. The part that makes what she did more complicated and more honest than the simple gift story. Anna Maria Luisa received no formal recognition in her lifetime for what she had done. The administration that benefited from her clause did not hold a ceremony for her. The diplomatic record does not show the new government pausing to acknowledge what she had arranged. She was, to the people running Florence after 1737, a resident of the previous regime, courteous to deal with, administratively convenient to pension off, and ultimately beside the point. The Uffizi opened to the public in 1769, 26 years after she died. She never saw it as a public museum. The Gallery degli Uffizi recorded 5,249,968 visitors in 2024. Over 5 million people in 1 year in one museum complex whose public legal character traces directly to the Patto di Famiglia. The older historiography, 20th century English and German accounts of the late Medici period, treated her as a supporting figure. The Mourner, the Last Witness. Casciu's 2006 volume La Principessa Saggia, l'eredità di Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, Electress Palatina, the scholarly catalogue of the commemorative exhibition at the Pitti Palace, corrects this. Not a figure at the end of a story. The person who decided what the end would legally mean. Those are not the same thing. The Uffizi, the Pitti Palace, the Bargello, the Boboli Gardens, the scientific collections. All of them public institutions, legally, not by tradition, not by goodwill, because of the conditions she attached to a donation in October 1737. The Gallery degli Uffizi recorded 5,249,968 visitors in 2024. Over 5 million people in 1 year in one museum complex. That number exists because the legal character of those institutions, public, inalienable, permanently in Florence, was written into the title in the autumn of 1737 by a woman the new government was treating as a retired inconvenience. Every year on February 18th, the anniversary of her death, the museums open for free. A ceremony is held at her tomb in the Basilica di San Lorenzo. The Gallery degli Uffizi mark it on their institutional calendar. Not because she was Grand Duchess, because of the clause. She could not keep the throne, could not keep the dynasty, could not keep the apartments, the servants, the political succession her father had spent decades lobbying European powers to secure for her, and the men at the treaty table had simply overruled. She kept one clause, in one document, signed on one October afternoon when nobody powerful was paying attention. The clause kept everything else, and it is still keeping it, every single day.